Hello and welcome. So today we're going to be having a look at the housing market, and specifically we're going to be having a look at how the housing market impacts the labour market. We're going to have a little look at the housing market in general, but we are going to look at how the housing market impacts the labour market. Now before we do that, I kind of want us to have a little think about wages in general and decision making process of individuals. That's really important for us to understand the housing market a little bit. So if you think about it like this, you have your lifetime, right? And you have an expectation of earnings, right? So this is your lifetime, so this is time. And you have an expectation of your wage. Now, actually, what really happens is, and we have your decision making, is you have an expectation in your brain of what your average wage is going to be throughout your life, right? So you kind of have an idea of your average wage, right? And you will make decisions based on your average wage, not necessarily based on your current wage. Now that's really important when we think about decision-making ways of entering labour markets. This is why individuals might take a job that doesn't offer them a very good wage at the moment, but offers them a lot of opportunity for wage growth in the future, because their average wage over their lifetime will be higher if they take that job, even though their momentary wage, the wage at that moment in time, is actually going to be lower than another potential job offer. Because you're actually aiming to maximise your wage bar, right? So as an individual, as a worker who is entering the labour market, what you're aiming to do is to maximise this wage bar. You're not aiming necessarily to maximise your wage right now, you are maximising your lifetime earnings. Think about it like that. So you're maximising your lifetime earnings, and that gives you an average wage throughout your life. Now, this isn't what you are going to be earning. Say, for instance, this isn't going to be like £40,000 that you do from day one to all the way. You will have actual earnings, and your actual earnings will look probably something like this, and they will peter off. So your actual earnings will look like this. This is your wage bar, and this is your kind of actual. And you have that average there. And you will make decisions in the labour market that allow you to do that. Now, that you're kind of thinking about, how does this relate to the housing market? Excellent question. And the way that relates to the housing market is because when you are earning, say for instance, down here, you are going to, what are you going to do? What would be the rational thing to do when you are earning down here, right? Where your average wage is lower than your expected wage? Well, you're going to borrow, right? You will borrow. So you will borrow so that you kind of make some form of bridge between those two. And one of the ways that people borrow in some economies is through the housing markets. They will borrow so that they can obtain an asset that is hopefully going to grow at a faster rate than their interest, right? Than the interest on their what they've borrowed. And that allows them to maximise their lifetime earnings, right? Because remember, your lifetime earnings aren't just your job, you also have other earnings as well. I kind of touched upon that very briefly in our last lesson, but for you to understand, you have your earnings from income, and then you have your other earnings as well. That might be dividends, that might be, assets that have acquired additional value over time. One of those assets may well be a house, right? So the idea is, one of the ways that you might maximise your lifetime earnings is by borrowing to buy potentially something like a property, and you will be able to hopefully gain some kind of value on that asset, and therefore that will lead you to later on in life having a bump, and therefore your average lifetime earning will be higher. But that's important because the housing market therefore has a big impact on your decisions in the labour market, and it has a big impact on your decisions when you are taking job roles. Now, that's not true for every single economy in the world, right? We in the UK have a particular kind of onus on owning your own home, right? So having an asset or owning that asset. And that's not true of every single economy. In some economies, they don't own their own home and they have a system of long-term renting, and that has impacts on their economy and their labour market specifically, that we will have a look at a little bit later on in this lesson. And it's a really, really important question. Like, it's a much bigger economical question that you should be asking yourselves and you should be interested in and you should have opinions on. So what I want you to do now is have a look at these two houses, right? I found two houses. One of them is in Lincoln and one of them is in Ilford. Not comparable areas when you think about kind of a historic value of those two. Not that I'm, dissing Ilford in any way, shape or form, but they have the Magna Carta in Lincoln, so, it's pretty important. But these two are comparable homes, right? They're both semi-detached terraced houses. They're both 4 bedrooms. Obviously, however, the price difference between those two homes is huge, right? It's absolutely huge. And I want you to think about what impact that has on the labour market. So I want you to have a look at this kind of picture that's on the screen right now. And I want you to think about what impact that is going to have on the labour market. Pause the video, write down all the things that you think it's going to influence and what that means, and think about how we can kind of apply that to different areas of things that we have learned already. So, the first thing that should immediately spring to mind is obviously going to do with the backwards bending labour supply curve. If you watch the backwards bending labour supply curve video, you can see right at the start that we talk about this wage star. Right, now, wage star here is very different to the wage bar that we talked about just a moment ago. I know it's super confusing, but if you kind of think about it, so wage star here is when your income effect is equal to substitution effect, and your wage bar is your average lifetime earnings that I was talking about a moment ago. Very, very different. So your wage star is kind of momentary, if you think about it like that. So your wage star is like the wage that you would receive at the moment, and we know that it's kind of changes over time, but whereas your wage bar is your entire lifetime earnings. Average lifetime earnings, not cumulative lifetime earnings. Anyway, so your wage star is going to be influenced by your housing cost, right? And that makes complete sense, because if your housing cost is really high, then you need to earn, you're going to be more willing to work extra hours. Your substitution effect is going to be bigger than your income effect, right? Because your housing costs are higher, and therefore you need to earn more to be able to cover that housing cost. So your wage star is going to be higher. So say for instance, if somebody moved from Lincoln to Ilford, if you think about that example before, their wage star is going to increase dramatically because they need to be able to cover their housing costs. And if you think back to when we watched that video right at the start and I break down the bills and the housing costs and all the things that influence your kind of necessities that need to be covered, housing is such a huge part of that. So you need to be able to understand that if your housing costs increase, or if they're just high in general, then that's going to have a big impact on your wage star. Equally, if you kind of move to an area, if you say you do the opposite of that transition, if you go from Ilford to Lincoln, then your wage star is going to potentially fall dramatically. You can earn less, and therefore you are going to be able to afford, or if you earn the same, then you're going to be able to afford a lot more, or you're willing to earn less because your kind of basic necessities are covered at a much lower rate, so your wage star is going to fall. And that's going to have a big impact on the amount of hours that you're going to be willing to work, and also equally it's going to have a big impact on the wage equilibrium of an economy and an industry, because the higher your housing costs, the more you're going to demand from your wage. And equally, here specifically, the relationship that we're talking about is the amount of hours you are willing to work, right? So potentially, if your housing costs are higher, you might actually be willing to work more hours and give up less leisure time. And that is not necessarily a good thing, because what this hours here doesn't necessarily talk about your productivity of labour, right? So I'm not saying that housing costs should be really high. I mean, you could potentially make an argument, but I am not saying that if housing costs are really high, people are going to be willing to work more and therefore productivity in the economy is going to rise. That's definitely not true, because we know that there is diminishing returns to labour. Essentially, the more hours that you put in, the less productivity you're going to have, right? Because you're tired. And we know that if you think about way back to PPF curves, you may well be overusing your labour, right? So you might be producing more than you can, and that's not going to be good in the long run. So it's not necessarily a positive thing, the idea that if your wage star is higher, you're going to dedicate more hours. But equally, it definitely has an effect. When your housing costs are higher, you have to earn a higher income, and there are several ways that can happen. And that has kind of led to a lot of the inequality that we see in London. But one of the impacts is going to potentially be that you're going to have to dedicate more hours to work. And equally, if you leave somewhere and you have lower housing costs, you may well start dedicating less hours to work, right? Now, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are less productive. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are more productive, but it does have an impact, and we can make an argument for the amount of hours that an individual is going to be able to work. So obviously, higher housing costs, your W star is going to increase, and you may show that in the exam. So you can say that, your W star has increased. I don't know why I've done it this way, but I have done. So you can, like that. So now we're at a much higher amount of hours that someone is willing to work before they start working less, and their wage increases, because the substitution effect is greater than the income effect at higher wages. So they're willing to work more hours. The second reason that housing affects the labour market is because of immobility of labour. Now, you can think of that specifically as geographical. If you own a home, right? And when I say own a home, I want to be slightly more specific, but it is true when you own a home, but it's also more true when you have a mortgage on a home. So you are borrowing, you're essentially buying back. A mortgage is essentially the bank buys it for you and you buy it back from the bank. It's not quite that simple, but if you think about it like that, it will be essentially very useful for you under these conditions. But if you own a home, or you've bought a home and you're buying that home back from the bank, then you're stuck in that area, you're stuck buying that. And if you think right back to when I was kind of showing you that wage bar, if the return on that asset hasn't reached the point that you are happy with, if you haven't got a return on that asset yet, you haven't a return on that investment, you've borrowed and you're now waiting to get a return on that investment so that your wage bar is higher, then you are less likely to move, even if you can get a better job somewhere else. Or not necessarily a better job, but a job that means that you are more effective in the labour market, right? So you as a unit of human capital should be working in a different area. You should be using your labour in another area to maximise output in that area. But you won't go and do that because you're stuck with this house, right? So you're stuck in that kind of area owning that house. That's geographical immobility of labour. Owning houses in a certain area is geographical immobility of labour. It increases geographical immobility of labour because you're fixed to a certain area. So that can have a huge impact on the productivity of labour markets. It can potentially, arguably, have a positive impact if you think about when we looked at those two pictures. If we had a look at those two pictures, you may have an increase in your labour supply in rural areas of individuals who can't buy in London and therefore tempted by lower house prices to outside of London areas or outside of urban areas in general, which means that can be a boost. So that could potentially be a good thing, but equally, even then, like say for instance, house prices are much lower in Lincoln than they are in London, and therefore individuals are going to move to Lincoln to be able to buy a house or a bigger house for the same amount of money, means that Lincoln might get a boost in its labour market, but that still doesn't mean that the labour market is efficient. And it still doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't market failure, because those individuals might buy a house there and then they also are then kind of immobile geographically to that area that they bought that house in Lincoln. So the problem might be kind of lesser because there is some kind of pull to those areas. But it doesn't mean that that problem has been eradicated, and doesn't mean that there isn't a knock-on effect to that problem slightly later on as well. So it's still definitely there, and it's easy for us to be able to see that it stops individuals being able to kind of be more fluid and flexible in their labour to be able to move. Like, you're not just going to up and move somewhere, especially as even if you are going to up and move somewhere. So for instance, like, you might own a property in London, you might get a really good job somewhere else, or you might have the opportunity to kind of move your labour to somewhere that's going to be more effective for your labour to be using for the economy. But even if you are willing to move, even if you do want to move, even if your asset has gained enough equity for you to be able to move that asset to somewhere else, there may well be a time lag for you having to sell your house, having to buy another house up there, moving. That could take, 6 months, potentially even longer. And therefore, even if you are willing to be able to move, if you don't face the barrier to the market of having to acquire equity on your asset, you still have potentially a barrier of having to sell and then enter market of trying to find another house somewhere else that might also equally reduce your mobility, of geographical mobility of labour. And then obviously as well, we know that it's going to have a huge impact on wages overall. If my housing cost is much higher, I'm going to have to negotiate wages that are much higher. If I cannot negotiate wages that are much higher, I have two options. I can either leave that labour market and go and enter a labour market that has opportunities for me to earn a wage that is high enough for me to cover my housing costs. Or I can move somewhere else and leave where my housing cost is particularly high. Both of those options are potential labour market failure. If I am not entering into the labour market that is most effective for, and needs me, the market mechanisms have brought me to that labour market, if I cannot, and think about as well for society, so if it's better for society overall, if like the welfare of society is maximised by me as a unit of human capital to be a teacher, for instance, but if teaching doesn't pay me enough to be able to cover my housing costs, etc., if my housing costs rise and suddenly teaching doesn't pay me enough to be able to do that, I might leave and go to another market that does pay me enough to do that. Well, that has a negative impact on society. That is the market failing, right? It's failed to meet the needs of the wider society. If you think about when we talked about the golden rule of economics, the way that we look at market failure from a kind of non-capitalist perspective, that is market failure. So therefore, that high housing cost has potentially meant that I am not able to access certain markets, and therefore to be able to keep me in teaching, they have to pay me more, right? So they have to increase the wage in teaching. And we've seen that through wages in London being higher than wages outside of London. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the real wage is higher in London than outside of London. Now, when I talk about the real wage, what I mean by that is obviously not just adjusted for inflation, but purchasing power parity. You think about purchasing power parity, you might be earning a lot more in London than you would do in Lincoln. But when you think about how far that money gets you, when you think about housing costs, buying a house, and other living inside to outside of London, actually you may well be more kind of wealthy, inverted commas, outside of London than you are inside of London. So that housing cost can actually kind of become a little bit misleading when you look at wages and real wages, or wages when you take into account purchasing power parity, right? So it can dismantle, kind of disrupt the normal market mechanisms, and it can disrupt what labour supply is willing to give. It might change the elasticity of labour supply. It might mean that labour supply, if wages are increasing, might become more inelastic. If wages are decreasing, it might become more inelastic. It can have a huge effect on the elasticity of labour supply, and also it can have a huge effect on shifts in labour supply as well. Because obviously your wage, remember that when we look at our economy specifically, we're assuming that the wage that you gain is going to be equal to your ability to participate in an economy, right? Because our functions of money is remuneration and a mean of exchange, which means that whatever income you get is equal to however much you can kind of monetarily participate in the economy. So your wage is so important, right? Because you have to earn a certain amount to be able to live a certain kind of lifestyle and access goods and services. Which kind of leads me on to our last kind of question, our overall question. Is home ownership a good thing? Now, there are lots of economists who will 100% argue, and this isn't something that's necessarily going to come up on your exam, but it's definitely something you should be asking yourself, and it's something as economists that you should be interested in, and that is home ownership good? Because there's definitely an argument that those economies that don't have home ownership, that have long-term renting, have a much better kind of fluidity of labour, and that labour is able to move around a lot more, it's able to be a lot more transferable, and that's really, really positive. Equally, when we look at capitalism and we look at the ownership of houses, there is a huge critique and point about the idea that when you own a house, actually, one of the main reasons that we encouraged borrowing to be able to own a house was to kind of keep those individuals who are working class, keeping them working, right? Because you give them all of this money and you let them buy that asset of that house, but for that section of their kind of wage where they're earning under their wage bar, you have to keep working, right? Because you have to pay back that asset that you have borrowed, right? You need to pay back the money that you borrowed to buy that asset. So in that area where your wage is below your current wage is below your wage bar, you have borrowed, and therefore you have to keep working. You can't stop working, right? You have to be in the labour market continuously. And, there is this idea that was introduced to make sure that those who were working class carried on working, and trapped them into this, kind of world where they had borrowed a lot of money, and therefore they had to keep working and giving their labour to those who were kind of landowners. And that meant that they were never allowed to take a break from the labour market to keep our kind of capitalist economy going, to make wealth for those who are in the upper class. And equally, if you think about like the labour market, London's a very good example. Gentrification, so many critiques of that home ownership, and the idea that, if you have home ownership, then that means that individuals who can't afford to buy houses, if they make an area nice, then those individuals who can afford to buy houses will move into those areas, pushing out those who can't afford to buy houses because rent increases, etc., and you lose a lot of cultural value in certain areas. Equally, there's a lot of other sides to that argument as well that talk about actually it gives those individuals who were working class an opportunity to buy their house, gain additional wealth, and through that asset purchase of the house, and then therefore they're able to sell it at a much higher price and gain wealth that they would never have before been able to have. So there's a lot of arguments, and this idea of is home ownership good is a really important question for our economy. Like I said before, there are lots of economies that don't have home ownership, they have long-term renting, and that means that labour is able to transfer a lot easier. It means that individuals report sometimes a lot kind of more happiness because they have less stress about having to pay a certain mortgage or pay back a debt, or having that debt kind of looming over them. So there are arguments on both sides, and it's really important for you guys to be able to potentially do some research and have a look at whether you think economically home ownership is positive for the wider economy. So I'm going to leave you on that. I hope that you research it. I hope you look into it. It's really, really interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next lesson. Bye!